No one noticed the pattern at first, because patterns hide best inside routine. And there is no routine more trusted than Sunday morning in America's Bible Belt, where church bells ring like promises and neighbors wave like family. It was in this world of open doors and unquestioned faith that a quiet presence began to move. Never rushing, never forcing, never leaving marks that could be easily named. Only absence, only silence, only the faint echo of someone who had been there and was now gone. Long before the newspapers would give him a name, long before investigators would connect towns separated by highways and hymns, he was simply a boy sitting in the back pew of a small wooden church in rural Georgia. He was born into a family that believed discipline was love and obedience was salvation, raised under a roof where the Bible was read daily but never discussed. Questions were treated like temptations, emotions like weaknesses. From an early age, he learned the most important lesson of all: silence keeps you safe. His childhood wasn't marked by obvious chaos or cruelty, which is why no one ever looked twice at him later. His parents were respected. His father, a deacon known for his firm handshake and moral certainty. His mother, a Sunday school teacher whose smile never reached her eyes. Inside that house, affection was structured, scheduled, conditional. Praise was earned only through performance, and mistakes were remembered longer than successes. So the boy learned to disappear inside himself, to observe instead of participate, to listen instead of speak. He developed an unusual sensitivity to tone and posture and pauses, an ability to read what people meant rather than what they said. While other children played loudly outside, he stayed indoors with books. Not stories of fantasy or adventure, but biographies, sermons, and old newspaper clippings his father kept neatly stacked. Stories about sin and consequence, about fallen men and public shame. He became fascinated not with the crimes themselves, but with the aftermath. How communities reacted, how quickly certainty dissolved into doubt, how rumors replaced facts, and how easily people filled silence with stories that made them feel safe. At school, he was unremarkable. Intelligent, but not exceptional. Polite, but distant. The kind of student teachers trusted without remembering. When he went on to attend a small Christian college, studying sociology under the justification of understanding people to better serve God, he learned the language of systems and structures, of social masks and moral performance. These concepts quietly confirmed what he had always felt but never named, that goodness was often a role people played, and roles could be manipulated. He didn't stand out in college either. He didn't drink or rebel. He didn't date seriously. He volunteered for church outreach programs and community assistance drives, gaining access to homes, stories, and vulnerabilities under the warm approval of pastors and organizers. After graduation, he moved through a series of service-oriented jobs counseling assistant, nonprofit coordinator, church outreach liaison. These roles placed him in constant contact with people seeking help, guidance, or forgiveness, people already trained to trust. All the while, he lived a life so clean it was invisible. No criminal record, no scandals, no emotional attachments. Just a modest apartment, carefully scheduled days, and a habit of driving long distances at night, listening to sermons on the radio, absorbing the rhythm of confession and redemption. Until one day, in a small Alabama town, a woman did not arrive for choir practice. The assumption was simple, gentle, temporary, because in places like that, nothing bad ever starts as bad. It starts as delayed, misunderstood, explainable. When another absence followed months later in a different state, and then another, spread out just enough to avoid panic, a narrative never settled. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious connections, only people who seemed to have stepped out of their lives quietly. What no one realized yet was that the boy who had learned silence as survival had grown into a man who understood something far more dangerous. That in communities built on faith, The greatest weapon was trust, and the greatest camouflage was righteousness. Somewhere between Sunday bells and empty roads, a method was forming, not violent, not chaotic, but patient, intentional, and terrifying precisely because it left nothing behind but questions. As whispers began to travel through sheriff offices and church basements, one unspoken fear slowly took shape. A fear no one wanted to say aloud in a place built on belief that evil did not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looked like belonging. The first real crack in the illusion didn't come from a scream or a siren. It came from paperwork, from the quiet frustration of a county investigator in Tennessee. He noticed that 3 unrelated missing person files, filed months apart and miles away from each other, all shared the same unsettling detail. Each disappearance happened after some kind of church-related interaction, a counseling session, a charity visit, a volunteer sign-up. These were moments meant to restore faith, not test it. As he leaned back in his chair late one evening, staring at dates and addresses that refused to align, he felt an uncomfortable sensation. It was as if something was moving through these towns, like smoke through open windows, uninvited, unnoticed, and leaving no fingerprints. Meanwhile, the man at the center of it all continued his carefully constructed life. He was advancing steadily in his career within faith-based nonprofit networks. He'd gained a reputation as dependable, calm under pressure, and unusually patient. He was someone who listened without interrupting, who remembered details others forgot, who spoke softly but with authority. These traits made pastors recommend him and families welcome him. It was during this phase of his life that his inner world grew more deliberate, more structured. What began as simple observation in his childhood had now evolved into quiet experimentation, not with harm, but with influence, with presence, with how easily people handed over their trust when it was wrapped in scripture and service. His education had given him theory, but experience gave him confirmation. People longed to be guided, especially when they were tired, lonely, or uncertain. The Bible Belt was full of such people, bound together by tradition, yet isolated by expectation, trained to smile through their struggles and confess only to God. He learned to position himself as the answer to their unspoken needs. He never promised salvation, only understanding. He never demanded obedience, only offered relief. So when people withdrew from their routines after encountering him, it didn't raise alarms. Withdrawal itself was common, often interpreted as spiritual reflection, a personal retreat, or a private struggle. Investigators, working across jurisdictions that rarely shared information efficiently, struggled with the lack of overt evidence. There was no violence to point to, no crime scene to secure, no suspect to interrogate, only absence and suggestion. Every time a theory formed, it dissolved under scrutiny, dismissed as mere coincidence or overreach. This delay wasn't accidental. The man had learned to space his movements, to let time erase any sense of urgency, to trust that bureaucracy would bury the connections under paperwork and pride. His lifestyle remained disciplined and unremarkable. His apartment was sparsely furnished, his routines almost monastic, early mornings, long drives, careful notes. These notes weren't trophies, but reflections, observations on how conversations turned, how people responded to reassurance, how easily certainty could be replaced by doubt. In his mind, he wasn't committing crimes, but conducting a kind of moral experiment, testing how belief systems reacted when gently disrupted, when trusted figures introduced uncertainty without using force. Slowly, however, pressure began to build beneath the surface. Families pushed harder for answers. A journalist in Mississippi started comparing stories after receiving multiple anonymous tips hinting at church-related connections. When an article finally appeared, questioning whether faith-based outreach programs were being exploited by someone with darker intentions, the reaction was swift and defensive. Institutions built on moral authority do not welcome scrutiny, and this resistance ironically deepened suspicion, drawing attention to what had previously been ignored. The man sensed the shift before anyone confronted him directly. He was highly attuned to tone, to the subtle tightening of smiles, the slight hesitation before invitations were extended, the way conversations ended more quickly. Rather than panic, he adapted. He stepped back from public roles, declined visible positions, and transitioned into consulting work that kept him mobile and untraceable. It was during this retreat that his internal narrative began to change. For the first time, he felt something resembling pressure. It wasn't fear of capture, but a fear of being misunderstood, of his actions being reduced to simple labels rather than profound questions. This perceived injustice fueled a quiet resentment toward the very communities that had once welcomed him, strengthening his belief that faith without awareness was fragile and deserved to be tested. Law enforcement task forces slowly formed, hampered by politics and limited resources, but united by a growing intuition that the disappearances were not random. They believed someone was exploiting trust rather than breaking it. Profiles began to shift away from stereotypical predators toward a figure who could blend seamlessly into moral environments. Someone educated, controlled, and ideologically motivated. Although no name surfaced, the idea of the Bible Belt Strangler began circulating informally. The name wasn't about the method, but the symbolism. Something invisible was tightening around these communities, not around bodies, but around belief itself. As the man drove through another quiet town one evening, church signs glowing softly in the dark, he felt neither triumph nor guilt, only a profound sense of inevitability. He was unaware, or perhaps fully aware, that patterns, no matter how carefully hidden, always rise to the surface eventually, not through force, but through attention. And somewhere between suspicion and denial, the hunt was finally becoming real. The moment he realized the silence was no longer protecting him, it had come with an arrest or a confrontation. It came from a sermon, one he listened to alone in his car, late at night. The pastor spoke about wolves that didn't arrive snarling, but smiling. And even though no name was spoken, the words felt uncomfortably precise, as if the world itself had started speaking directly to him. From that moment on, everything he had relied upon, the slow pace of rural towns, the reluctance of people to accuse, the general assumption of goodness, all of it began to subtly turn against him. By now, law enforcement task forces had grown more coordinated. Analysts weren't just mapping incidents anymore. They were mapping movements. They started focusing on who appeared repeatedly on the edges of stories, not just at their center. Slowly, a profile emerged that matched him far too closely for comfort. A man with faith-based credentials who traveled extensively across the southern states. Someone with access to vulnerable individuals through moral authority, not physical force. Someone who understood people deeply but remained emotionally detached. His name still hadn't surfaced publicly, but internally he was no longer invisible. He adapted, just as he always had. He simplified his life even further, cutting off professional ties, selling his belongings, and minimizing his digital footprint. He tried to convince himself this wasn't a retreat, but an evolution. He told himself he always knew this phase would come, that systems eventually resist disruption. But beneath this rationalization, his inner order began to fracture. The isolation no longer felt chosen. It felt imposed. The observer who once found comfort in distance now felt watched by the very patterns he had mastered. His thoughts grew more rigid, almost philosophical. He framed his actions as necessary mirrors held up to communities that were unwilling to confront their own fragility. This belief hardened into something close to a doctrine, a private theology where exposure was persecution and accountability was hypocrisy. Meanwhile, the investigators made their first direct mistake. It wasn't by accusing him, but by underestimating him. They assumed he would escalate, become reckless, and leave clear trails. In reality, he did the exact opposite. He withdrew almost completely, allowing time to blur the relevance of his past actions. He trusted that without new incidents, the attention would eventually fade. And for a while, it worked. Urgency is a difficult thing to maintain without a spectacle. But the pressure started coming from somewhere else, from people he never calculated into his design. Families who refused to accept closure, journalists who kept asking why churches were reacting so defensively, and community members who began to question authority instead of just submitting to it. This cultural shift unsettled him deeply. The experiment he believed he controlled had outgrown him, transforming into a broader skepticism he had neither predicted nor desired. His lifestyle, once defined by absolute control, became a cycle of repetition and rumination. Long, solitary drives. Notes rewritten again and again, as if he could restore clarity through language alone. And for the first time, cracks appeared in his composure during conversations. Small slips in his tone, and impatience masked as concern, moments where his calm felt rehearsed rather than natural. Law enforcement noticed these shifts too, not through evidence, but through absence. When they overlaid the timelines again, they saw the same figure consistently near the beginnings of events, but completely absent from their endings. A ghost that stopped appearing precisely when scrutiny increased. And this avoidance, in itself, became a crucial piece of data. A quiet interview request was drafted. It wasn't an accusation, just a conversation. But it never reached him. By then, he had already sensed the approach. He packed his car with only the essentials and drove toward another state, not to continue what he had done, but to escape definition, to preserve the narrative where he remained the unseen examiner, not the examined. Yet as the miles passed beneath his tires and the radio stations blurred into static, something fundamental shifted inside him. It was a realization he resisted but could not erase. Control doesn't belong to those who manipulate systems forever. Because systems learn, communities adapt, and belief, once questioned, never fully resets. By the time his vehicle crossed the state line, the name Bible Belt Strangler had entered public awareness. It was no longer whispered. It was debated. And though it didn't accurately describe his methods, it described his impact perfectly, because fear had tightened its grip around trust itself. As he disappeared into the vast anonymity of highways and rest stops, one truth followed him relentlessly. The silence he once commanded had finally begun to speak, and it was saying his story was nearing its end, whether he accepted that or not. The end didn't arrive with flashing lights or shouted commands. Stories like this rarely end with a spectacle. Instead, it settled slowly, like dust after a long collapse. The man who had spent his life mastering invisibility finally ran out of places where silence felt safe. He learned that anonymity isn't freedom when it's driven by fear. And somewhere along an ordinary stretch of highway, he understood that even if no cell door ever closed behind him, his experiment was already finished. He simply faded from public awareness. Not because he succeeded, but because the world no longer needed him to keep asking the questions he had forced into existence. Churches revised their outreach policies. Background checks became standard practice. Shared databases replaced isolated files. Communities once defined by unquestioned trust learned the difficult discipline of awareness, all without abandoning compassion. Investigators never stood before cameras to declare victory, because certainty was always just out of reach. The evidence was circumstantial, the timelines fragmented. And yet, in quiet reports and internal briefings, his name settled into its place. Not as a monster, but as a cautionary figure. Someone who exploited belief not through brutality, but through permission. He revealed how systems built entirely on assumed goodness have no defenses against those who understand their rules a little too well. As for him, his life narrowed into something smaller, heavier. His days filled with reflection rather than movement. His notebooks were abandoned, his theories stripped of all purpose. After all, influence loses its meaning when no one is watching. The mirror he once held up to others began reflecting only himself, a man who mistook observation for wisdom and control for truth. He believed that exposing fragility was the same as understanding it. The communities he passed through would remember the missing, not just for their absence, but for what came after. The conversations that finally happened, the questions that were once considered impolite, the realization that faith isn't weakened by vigilance, but protected by it. And though his name would blur with time, replaced by newer fears and louder stories, the change he triggered would remain, embedded in policy, in practice, and in memory. In the end, the true consequence wasn't capture or punishment. It was irrelevance. For someone who sought to test belief, the most devastating outcome was discovering that belief had evolved beyond him. It had learned to guard itself without surrendering its soul. And so the moral of the story settles quietly, without accusation or anger. It's a lesson written not in headlines, but in habits. That trust without awareness becomes vulnerability. That silence without reflection becomes blindness. And that evil doesn't always announce itself with chaos. Sometimes it enters politely, speaks the right language, and waits for permission. It reminds us that the responsibility to protect goodness belongs not only to faith, but to those who choose to question it wisely. The case may be closed, but crimology never sleeps. Like and subscribe join Crimology, and step deeper into the dark with us.